Hey guys, what's up? So for today's video, I decided to do something a little different for a topic today. This was something I had in mind for a while, but there was a recent thing that happened in movie news that made me want to do a video on this topic. You might know by now that it had been recently announced that Spider-Verse 2 will have a runtime of 2 hours and 20 minutes long. When I first heard of this news, I actually had two thoughts in mind. The first thought was that I actually think this is kinda cool, admittedly. I was already under the impression that Spider-Verse 2 was going to be this big grand epic of a film based on how awesome the first one was. But having close to a 2.5 hour runtime is really ambitious for the kind of movie it is. Not only do I think it sounds like they have something even bigger in store in the best possible way, but it's also just really neat to see because of how much of a rarity it is for animated films to be this long. Very few animated movies are even 2 hours long. So to see them take the risk and make what many would assume to be a kid's film be on the link of other big comic book movies, this shows to me that, damn, they're not fucking around, are they? So it makes a movie I'm already excited for all the more exciting. However, that was not my only thought when hearing about this news. The other thing I thought when hearing about this news, and something I've been honestly really sick of lately, was this. How many people are going to complain that something like this is close to 2.5 hours long without considering the possibility that it can still be a good movie? You might have seen stuff like this on Twitter, Facebook, or hell, maybe even in real life you've had conversations with people about this. But as of late, whenever I hear the news of a movie being around or even over 2.5 hours long, I hear all over the place, both online and in real life, a lot of complaining. I see people constantly complaining by saying, "Man, they made this movie 2.5 hours long? How dare they make this movie 2.5 hours long by making me take time out of my day to watch this movie?" It has gotten to a point where I simply have to ask, is a movie being long that big of a deal? The constant complaining about movies being too long, it's starting to get on my nerves, because whenever I hear most arguments relating to a movie's length, it just seems there's always a claim against them. As in, people shrug off a movie for no other reason than simply that it's too long. But is that really the case? Because long movies were never really anything that new. Since cinema was first a thing, really, we got movies of all different sorts of lengths, ranging from maybe an hour to 3 hours. There have been plenty of movies, back before even the year 2000, that were well over the runtime of 2 hours. A lot of these films are actually helmed as some of the most iconic and classic films of all time. Movies like The Sound of Music, The Godfather, 2001: A Space Odyssey, to name a few. All of these movies and so many others were quite lengthy for the time, but yet I don't see as many people talking about these movies being bad because of their length. They kinda needed that length to tell the story they needed to tell. And for the most part, these movies are still remembered regardless of that. So what changed to where people were so vitriolic towards longer movies? Well, there is one thing that did change.
And now we'll have a 15-minute intermission.
Before the advent of home media and the luxury of a pause button, longer movies had a thing called an intermission, where halfway through the movie, there would be around a 15-minute break for the audience to have a breather, maybe get some snacks, or use the restroom if needed. You still see these in plays because, well, live performers need that break. But for movies, they aren't really a thing anymore. Admittedly, this is one thing people have requested to bring back for longer movies that I actually agree with. You are in the theater for a relatively long time, so it wouldn't be too much trouble if studios encourage a break between major acts of the film. I mean, it would help a lot of those souls who have to hold their bladder for a long time that don't want to miss a second of the movie. With the amount of backlash long movies get, it makes me wonder why more studios or theater chains don't consider this. But even without the fact that we don't get intermissions nowadays, long movies have existed for quite some time throughout numerous decades of film, though it's really only now it's become a topic of discussion a lot. I have noticed that there have been more movies that are longer than usual in some cases, but does that in and of itself make these movies bad? People act like it is, but here's the kicker. A lot of the time, this disdain about being long is based on the fact the movie was announced as a 2.5 hour or 3 hour movie. It's a gut reaction that seems negative based on that fact without really considering what kind of movie it is. So to me, it feels like an unfair advantage to the filmmakers who want to bring a vision to the screen, and their vision happens to be a long one, because people shrug it off as long equals bad, when that should never be the case at all. Not to mention it's so heavily exaggerated in terms of this complaint because people act like we get nothing but long movies. I can't tell you the amount of times these long movies complaints are followed up by bring back 90-minute movies. And I'm just here like, bro, they never left. Look at movies like Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. That was around 90 minutes long. Hell, the most successful movie out right now is the Mario movie, which is also around the 90-minute time frame. Do these movies suddenly don't exist because Beau's Afraid, John Wick 4, and the Batman are closer to the 3-hour mark? Now, despite me thinking that long movies get a bad rap, I'm not saying that movies have to be over 2.5 hours or more. Far from it. There are certain lengths that work better for certain types of movies, and there are definitely examples of movies that are over 2 hours that didn't really need to be. Case in point, I have no idea who thought it was a good idea making the Little Mermaid remake close to 2.5 hours long. Any Disney remake being over 2 hours is bad enough. I can't handle this shit for more than 2 minutes. Especially when the original versions already told their stories perfectly within the hour-and-a-half time limit. So yeah, these are the main examples of movies that don't need to be this long. Though does that mean that other movies shouldn't be this long as well? Not necessarily, because there can be a lot of benefits to a movie being longer. I think one partial reason why some movies feel the need to be long as a way to feel grand, with so much story to tell that it needs a long runtime to do it justice. In a way, it can be very beneficial to a movie. They have more time to dedicate proper character and story development, making it essentially worth your time if you're going to be engaged with a film for so long. Again, not every movie close to this length knows how to do that, but there are still plenty of movies that do benefit the longer time because they know how to. All of the Lord of the Rings movies are very long, and they utilize their time well by fleshing out these characters and story beats to make this grand story feel more epic. If the Lord of the Rings movies didn't really do that, it probably would have felt rushed if they condensed it to 2 hours. Seven Samurai is another movie that utilized its time well by having all this time to really flesh out its big emotional story with a huge scale to it. And that's another film that's considered an all-time classic. Hell, I'm also willing to admit, while not as good as those movies I just mentioned, even something like a Zack Snyder movie benefits from a longer runtime. Not to say his movies are perfect, but as someone who enjoyed some of his films, I can tell you, the added time did make the grand feel of the movie better. And it also legit added stuff that did give some of these characters depth. Compare his cut of Justice League to the original cut, which is a whole 2 hours shorter. And don't act like the shorter cut is the better movie, because
do you bleed?
It isn't. And also, what Snyder added in terms of stuff with Cyborg and other character dynamics that were lacking in the original cut did make the movie better as a whole. Like I said, not perfect. Grand scheme of things, he did get a little carried away with that glorified post-credit scene. But it's another example of a movie benefiting from a longer runtime. So to see a lot of good films being shrugged off because the length is concerning, when sometimes I feel people who are this concerned about a movie's length don't know what they're missing out on when it comes to characters that are properly developed for a movie. It's funny because so much I hear people talk about how they prefer other forms of storytelling, like TV shows, books, or video games, because they prefer seeing more time dedicated to developing the story or characters further along. And those forms of media allow for a lot of time. Yet, whenever you ask those same people to watch a movie that's over 2.5 hours long, though I do have to acknowledge, there are some disadvantages to longer movies. The main one being for me is that, yeah, you do have to dedicate more time to watching it compared to other movies that aren't as long. Meaning if you want to marathon a bunch of movies and a lot of them are over 2.5 hours long, it will require more than just a day worth of watching them. Long movies aren't necessarily something that most people would put on casually in most cases, because they do have to be a little bit dedicated to it. So when a movie is around that length and the film doesn't really justify it, and you're not really into it for the majority of the runtime, of course you're going to feel like your time was wasted. Though that's when a longer film ends up being disappointing in a certain way. Let's not act like shorter movies are off the hook with having problems as well. Sure, you can watch potentially more of them within a day, and you won't feel like time is wasted too much, but narratively speaking, sometimes they can come up, for lack of a better term, rather short. Since there's so little time spent on shorter movies, there are plenty of examples where characters, story elements, and scenes that should be essential to creating a compelling narrative could feel rather rushed, meaning that maybe more time could have been added to flesh out those elements that make you feel like there could have been more. To give an example, for as much as I enjoyed the Mario movie, I felt there could have been more time within the film dedicated to character interaction, as the film rushes from set piece to set piece, leaving not a lot of room for characters to have dynamics and developments. Not saying you have to add too much time, but maybe an extra 10 or 15 minutes could have remedied those weak points by just having a little more moments for these characters to breathe. Though that's just an example of a 90-minute movie that didn't quite utilize its time as well as it could have. There are plenty of movies around this time frame that do make use of its time perfectly. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a better example of a 90-minute movie utilizing its time because they managed to give enough character, story, and scene development to make it a compelling story. Hell, sometimes a movie doesn't even have to be 90 minutes to utilize its runtime perfectly to give you the exact experience the filmmakers wanted. For example, Alice in Wonderland and A Nightmare Before Christmas are two of some of my all-time favorite films. These movies are barely an hour and 15 minutes long. Yet, I still think they work because of how they manage to entertain and enlighten audience with these lovable characters and creative set pieces for the entirety of that short time period. For me, these movies are perfect because they set out and deliver on the exact experience intended by the artists involved. Those are examples of short movies that I feel utilize their time well, but that doesn't mean movies that are longer than that can't utilize their time well either. A majority of movies have different set goals in mind, and sometimes those goals need to fully have a director's vision to be seen. Movies like Blade Runner 2049 and Babylon, to bring up a few more examples, are movies that I also love because they set out to do exactly what they intend to. While longer than the shorter movies I brought up, the filmmakers still made a film that utilized their time well, in my humble opinion, and I could still watch and be engaged with them regardless of how long I'm sitting down to watch them. There's an element to a movie being longer that I think should definitely be considered that a lot of my favorite movies that are longer do very well. That key element to really making a film better is not based on length, but on a little thing called pacing. Sure, a movie can be long, but does it feel long? There are movies that might be 2.5 hours or longer, but they don't feel it because they are paced so well to the point where every fast and slow moment in the film feels intentional and still engaging for whatever the moment is trying to convey for the movie as a whole. Pacing is the real factor to what can make or break a movie, since a bad pacing that doesn't utilize its time well, where scenes go on longer than needed, or don't engage with their audience that well at all. And this isn't an issue with just long movies, as most would like to believe, as movies that are shorter can be poorly paced too. I've seen movies that aren't even 2 hours long and yet feel longer than the Snyder Cut because of how horribly paced they are, ending up with a film that's boring either way. I'm looking at you, Milan 2020. Then on the opposite end, a good pacing can actually improve a film, as you're engaged with it the whole runtime, as every scene feels exactly how long they need it to be. To give a good example, let's take a look at my favorite movie of last year, Everything Everywhere All at Once. That film had so much energy and style to it that you can't help but be engaged throughout the whole thing. Every scene feels just right and worked well for this story, where I can't think of any major scene I would cut out to shorten it. This is another movie that is 2.5 hours long, and yet I barely feel it because of how perfectly paced it all is. So, just because a movie that's around that length can be poorly paced doesn't mean it applies to every movie, especially when this film is definitive proof of it, if you ask me. Now, you might be thinking I'm not accepting of other people's preference towards runtimes of movies, which, in reality, that's not necessarily the case. If your ideal movie length is 90 minutes, that's perfectly understandable. Everyone has different tastes, and that can also come down to them liking movies that are shorter for whatever reason. But that's a key thing I want to emphasize with this. That's personal preference. There's a difference between preferring movies that are shorter than just assuming a movie isn't good because of its length. I think it can be unfair criticism to say that a movie is bad for being long when there's a good chance that it's a movie that would be better if it is the length that it is. If you're not enjoying it because you prefer shorter movies, then it might not be the movie for you, and that's okay. Though don't act like it's the fault of the filmmaker and artist for making a longer movie that just doesn't jive with you. I think the best way to illustrate what I'm talking about, there's an argument I've seen a lot for video games that definitely reminds me of this. You know how game journalists can sometimes give a game a bad review by saying something along the lines of, "Wow, they made this game too hard, game's gonna be this difficult, they're not fun." A lot of gamers tend to hate this because there are games that are designed to be more challenging, and for a lot of players, that is part of the fun of it. Sure, there are examples of games that get way too carried away with their difficulty to the point where it's completely unbalanced or poor game design. But when a game is challenging in just the right way, thanks to proper game development, it can be honestly rewarding. A challenging game will encourage you to try again, and it can get to a point where once you master it, it can be a blast to play through and makes it feel like you accomplished so much. Though again, not every player is like this. Some want to just play a video game with ease, and that's totally fine too. Nothing wrong with games being super difficult or super easy, as long as they're designed in a way that's still satisfying to the player. If the player isn't a fan of the game's difficulty, despite how well designed everything else is, then maybe that game isn't for them. Shouldn't be a knock on the game designers who worked hard on giving the experience they intended, and that same sort of mentality I definitely think goes the same for movies. Just replace difficulty with length. A movie's length shouldn't be seen as an automatic bad thing, because all films have different goals in mind, and sometimes those goals don't align with other people's preferences. Which, in terms of preference, I noticed that some people who might not like longer movies for the most part will make exceptions to the rule depending on their own personal preferences. To give an idea, I know plenty of people who claim that The Godfather is one of the greatest films ever made, and don't care that much that it's 3 hours long because it utilized its time to tell the exact story it needed to. Yet, some who may think that The Godfather is perfect in spite of its length might not feel the same way about something like Avengers Endgame. Sure, they're the same length, but maybe the heavy action and Marvel-style humor wouldn't jive well with them for 3 hours like The Godfather did for them. It doesn't just stop there, as I know plenty of people who adore Return of the King for very similar reasons, as even with its long runtime, they feel it gives the exact perfect story it sets out for them. Yet, I also don't think that those same people would enjoy something like John Dielman. I can see them finding this movie that's a long, slow burn about a woman cleaning her house, yes, that's the actual plot of the movie, by the way, to be as engaging as a big fantasy epic like Lord of the Rings. Nothing inherently wrong with that either, because certain long movies appeal to different people, and you can tell by just how successful a lot of long movies are. Whenever a longer movie flops, you get plenty of claims about how people don't want to see 3-hour-long movies anymore. But are you really sure about that? Babylon's length does tend to be a reason why people bring up that it wasn't a box office hit. But that didn't stop Avatar 2 from making $1 billion, which is actually longer than Babylon, if you can believe it. In fact, the long runtime didn't stop a lot of movies from being a massive box office hit. So I think the whole "no one wants to see long movies" claims is false based on that alone. Maybe you wouldn't want to see a movie that's long like The Wolf of Wall Street, but maybe other people do. Yet you might enjoy something like Titanic a lot more, which is about the same runtime. So to say that movies being long is always a bad thing is just not true, based on every movie having different goals in mind, and those goals appealing to different types of audiences. So maybe instead of automatically assuming a movie could not be good because of its length, think about what that movie is trying to do first. And maybe even consider who that movie might be appealing for. Think about the movies you didn't mind being this length. Think about if this director has previously justified making films around a certain length, and if they are talented enough to pull it off. Or think about how wonderful this film would be if it manages to pull off being this long by being constantly engaging in some fashion. Maybe long movies aren't your thing, and that's okay. But I don't think it's always fair to presume that the people behind the films are making films longer at an expense for the audience. People, myself included, still love films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, Babylon, and The Batman because of how they manage to be an engaging experience throughout their entire runtime. So should I dismiss them just because they're all closer to the 2.5 hour mark? Personally, I don't think so. And I think it might be time to not let length be the biggest concern of a movie 24/7. There are worse things to be concerned about in regards to a film's quality, and maybe put length into consideration when the more unacceptable qualities pop their way in. Bottom line, I'm psyched for something like Spider-Verse 2, and even a few other movies that could potentially be longer, because as long as they're good, that's what matters the most. It doesn't matter how long or short a movie is, as long as they can bring you an incredible experience when you sit down to watch it, regardless of how long your eyes are glued to the screen. So take that for what it's worth. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. And I hope this video does make you consider not being as hung up about a movie's length anymore. And even if you watch through this and aren't convinced about a length of a movie not being a bad thing, well, at least we can agree on this.
Quite figure it out.
She got legs, you idiot.
There is absolutely no f***ing reason why something like this shit has to be around 2.5 hours long. Thank you and good night.
Just have to go the long way.
Yeah, the long